Just waiting for it to pop up. All right, what's up, everyone? Franco here with Frank Analysis. I'm joined today by a lovely panel of strong, independent, anti-imperialist voices with Latin American roots. We are here to discuss a bit about the history of Peru's politics and their elections, which will take place June 6, 2021. We have a far-right candidate in Keiko Fujimori going up against a socialist candidate in Pedro Castillo, who the mainstream media in Peru are calling a far left candidate, even though he is more of a moderately left candidate. Based on the research that I've done, he's also anti-imperialist, but he has socially conservative policies. Castillo is leading in the polls right now as of May 3rd at 43%, and Keiko Fujimori is at 36%, according to ISPO's survey for America Televisión. So for people who don't know, I'm a descendant of Peru. Both my parents came here from Lima, Peru in the early 90s to work in the field of biology. I have family members here in the States and in Peru, and we have traveled there a lot. I've gone to Peru at least over a dozen times. In my panel today, I will introduce everybody one by one, and you can give some more background about yourselves and why this election in Peru is important to you, starting with Fiorella, fellow member of the MCSC network and co-host of the Convo Couch. What's up? Also fellow
Hey,
Peruvian.
Yeah. Hey, Franco. How are you?
Good. So why is this election important to you?
Right. Well, I'm like an election integrity activist, and that's for every election. And what I've seen in the United States is that there's a lack of election transparency. And what I've seen the United States do in elections in Latin America is interfere continuously to try to undermine governments and overthrow them and install their own regimes that will back the capitalist imperialist empire that we are living in. And Peru in particular has been a country that has been riddled by a neoliberal government and has had various presidents that have been absolutely controlled by the United States since basically for a long time, I mean, since the dictatorship of Alberto Fujimori, right? And right now there's a chance to usher in I agree with you, a moderate leftist I think he is less left than the party he's in. I think that the people of the party he represents are actually fundamentally more into a type of leftist government that we would call socialist, where you're nationalizing certain industries, etc. But I think the candidate himself is actually pretty moderate. There are some things that I disagree with him on, obviously, but at the same time, Peru's politics is different than the United States, and it's what we have to take into consideration when we're talking about these elections. We also have to take into consideration the reason why this election is so important is because Keiko Fujimori is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, who had established a dictatorship in Peru where thousands of people were killed. And the CIA, of course, was also helping that regime out during this time. And we can talk about that. But I think it's important that you're seeing leftism and neoliberalism go head to head. And the reason it's such a contentious election is because Peru, because of the history with the Shining Path and Sendero Luminoso, as Peruvians know it, they are so anti-left. Like a lot of my family members are very much anti-left in Peru. My family, like yours, emigrated here from Peru, but my immigration was mostly due to the fact that there were terrorist attacks, pushed out by the Shining Path. Now, this is that you can't deny that these attacks happened, right? But the intricacies that political intricacies that happened in between are much deeper than that. And so for my family, my dad, he worked with the banks and he worked in that industry, and those industries were attacked. There were threats, etc. So for me to be a leftist, a staunch advocate is extremely troubling to some of them. While simultaneously on my mother's side of the family, there were more leftists that were completely against Alberto Fujimori. So it's really interesting. And like I remember, vaguely, my family immigrated here in 1993, and when I came here, I was about 4 years old by the time I got here, and I just heard so many stories that I grew up thinking, oh my God, these people are just straight up terrorists, and oh my God, like this happened one way. It was very black and white. As I learned further, I realized that their experience wasn't not real. It's just that the context of US imperialism and their involvement and the involvement of pro capitalism and the attempt to just meddle in Peru's election, just how far the United States has continuously meddled in the government of Peru, has to be taken into context when you're looking at the whole situation.
Yeah. I have a lot of parallels with that too. My family, they told me stories about the communists there and calling them all terrorists, very black and white thinking. We're going to get into all that. Second, we have Ramiro Sebastian Funes, a Honduran communist content creator based in LA. How are you doing, brother?
I'm doing all right, man. Thanks for having me on. And it's really cool to be talking about Peru. And I definitely agree with what Comrade Fiorella was mentioning about the battle of ideas playing out in Peru. I mean, you couldn't have two diametrically opposed opposites as we are seeing now. We have Keiko Fujimori, who represents not only right-wing capitalism, but this sort of right-wing, quote-unquote, populist capitalism that's borderline fascism, or is fascist, I believe, and is in favor of the free market, in favor of police crackdowns. She's talking about bringing back the constitution of her father, which if you look at the constitution of Fujimori in the 90s, you're talking about rounding up leftists, rounding up activists, people, even people who aren't socialists or communists, people who are labor activists, indigenous rights activists, rounding them up using police. He kind of represents this sort of Trumpian right-wing prison military industrial complex that favors brute force, favors hardline capitalist approaches, which is out of style in a lot of places because it's so obviously right-wing. But she kind of represents that. And so she has her base, Keiko Fujimori, and then you have, who's with the Free Peru Party, which is talking about socialism. There's some aspects of Mariateguismo involved in that party, which we can maybe go into later. Jose Carlos Mariategui, indigenous communist activist in Peru. And Peru Libre's slogan is really beautiful: no more poor in a rich country. And I think that encapsulates what a lot of people in Peru believe, is that we're talking about one of the largest countries in Latin America that has some of the most valuable natural resources: gold, copper, zinc, the chemicals and the ingredients needed for travel. I mean, it borders Bolivia, which is where the huge salt flats are, where the lithium reserves are. And lithium, as we know, is something that is extremely important in the 21st century for technology, for the arms race. So Peru has a lot of wealth and natural resources, but unfortunately also has some of the highest poverty rates in South America, especially by the indigenous peoples. And so I think that's another way we have to frame this as well, as an aspect of national liberation, because we have somebody like Keiko Fujimori who represents a settler class. What's interesting about Peru is that it has a history of having one of the largest, I think, if not the largest, Japanese diaspora community in Latin America, I think outside of Brazil. But it's interesting because a lot of the Japanese who settled in Peru tend to form part of the business merchant class, capitalist class based in Lima and Callao and the port cities. And you have this candidate from Free Peru who's indigenous, who's obviously indigenous looking, represents South and Southeastern Peru, which is the radical revolutionary homeland of the Peruvian people. And so we see not only the battle of ideas of right-wing Ayn Rand libertarianism, police crackdowns, strength is the best, versus indigenous socialism versus 21st century socialism, national liberation. And so I'm very curious to see what happens in the second round on June 6th, because it'll determine the flow of politics for the rest of Latin America. I mean, it's something that we're seeing play out all over the region, the battle of ideas. And I think just one last point before we move on, it's also important to mention that Peru was one of the worst affected countries by COVID-19, by the pandemic,
Yeah, it was.
and the economic crisis in Peru is really bad right now. I think the gross domestic product fell by 30.2%, which is huge in 2020. So there's a huge crisis right now in Peru, and now is a chance to see what will ultimately save Peru. Will it be free market libertarianism, let the market decide, or will it be indigenous socialism and liberation?
Well said. Yeah, and last but not least, we have my friend Skeptical Mantis, a Latin American communist and Maoist based in New York City. How's it going, brother?
Yo, what's up, Franco? Thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation. It will be very interesting. I've been studying Peru like crazy for the last week or two, as you know. We've been talking about this a lot. Feel like I've learned a lot. Why is this election important to me? Well, it's going to affect the balance of power all over Latin America, even if Pedro Castillo is a rather moderate leftist, and he doesn't seem to be as extreme as the capitalist media are making him out to be. It's kind of like how people try to act like Bernie was a super communist. It's like that, you know? So even if he's rather moderate, I guess I've been wondering if it's really true that he's more moderate than his party, or if they're trying to present two opposing positions at the same time, if you know what I mean. Like, he can pretend to be more moderate while the party's low-key, like, more revolutionary, but who knows which face is the real one. We don't know what this guy is about. Like, he's a real outsider. That's something we had discussed before.
Yeah.
Unlike the politics of the US, where you see these fake outsiders like Trump, this guy's actually a real outsider. He's not established in Peruvian elite circles. Like, he comes from the left, more or less, like union movements. He was a teacher. So we don't know what he's going to be about. He's like a wild card in my eyes. And I do think it could be a step in the right direction. It will affect all of Latin America as well as the world, right? And especially us here in the United States. You know, we're Latin Americans living in the United States, and they consider, the US imperialists consider Latin America to be their playground or their backyard or whatever, you know? So it's going to sharpen the contradictions in the US too, if Latin America starts moving farther left.
Yeah. Yeah, let's talk about the two candidates here. Fujimori, she is the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, like how you guys discussed, who is a Japanese Peruvian that was president of Peru from 1990 to 2000. He was far-right, corrupt, he committed war crimes, he implemented several far-right policies like privatizing a lot of Peru's public sectors, and he helped prosper the lives of Peru's elite class at the expense of working class people. During the early 90s, Peru was undergoing a civil war against a faction of the People's Communist Party, some of whom took things too far and killed several innocent people. Fujimori, with the aid of the CIA, was able to take these terrorists down. However, during the process, Fujimori committed war crimes, and even after that, he committed more crimes against humanity. He is a wanted man. He fled to Japan. So if Keiko becomes president, she's gonna pardon her father. She's also wanted for corruption. She also was in jail, and so she's gonna pardon herself. Pedro Castillo is a teacher from Cajamarca, Peru. This is a more rural area than Peru's capital, Lima. He is a member of a party called Peru Libre that calls itself Marxist-Leninist. The Peruvian mainstream media says that he has ties to Movadef, which is the Shining Path or Sendero Luminoso. I have yet to see any concrete evidence of this upon my research. To me, it seems like it's all word of mouth. But yeah, let me know what else you guys would like to elaborate about these two candidates, starting with
Franco,
Firella.
real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just say, I think it's not fair to call the Shining Path terrorists. That's a very loaded term. I think they were revolutionaries, and they did do bad things during the war, especially at certain points. They did really terrible massacres that we shouldn't defend or make excuses for. But to say that they're terrorists, I don't know, that doesn't sit right with me, considering that the state were the real terrorists and they did a lot of war crimes themselves against the people, you know? It's not to make excuses, but just to put things in context that the Peruvian Communist Party, the Shining Path, had many righteous goals, especially early on. And a lot of people did welcome them, especially early on, before they basically destroyed their reputation by doing some stupid stuff. Just a
Yes, and
side note,
some
but
of
we
it
can get
was
more into that later.
inexcusable. But yeah, what do you think, Fiorella?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, like, for me,
Yeah.
because it's like, you know, like, some of it is absolutely inexcusable. And like, as somebody that, you know, I consider myself ideologically an anarcho-communist, you know, I fully believe in the decentralization of power. And one of the fears for me is, you know, like, the way that leftist movements hurt themselves is by oftentimes being just this, having this idea that we have to establish a sort of complete and total dictatorship of it, just using violence. And the state is violent, right? The state is violent. So anything you do against the state is going to be considered violence. So I think there are methods where I agree 100%, like, you're going to have to use violence against the state because you're being oppressed. So anything you do is going to be considered violence. However, when you're talking about people, like innocent people getting killed and certain leftist groups also getting killed, it's hard to say that it wasn't considered terrorism by some people. But given the context, like Skeptical Mantis says, like, you do have to take into consideration, like, it's very nuanced. It's not black and white. And I mean, we're having a very important yet difficult discussion because, like we said, Franco, a lot of us grew up with this idea, like, oh my God, these people are terrorists and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, people died. We have to admit that. But one thing I wanted to go on is that the USAID was heavily involved, not just obviously in Peru, but all over Latin America, right, as a front. And you did mention that the CIA did fund Fujimori, and his second-hand man, Humala, was the one that was a CIA asset. And I have yet to see any proof, however, that Pedro Castillo is actually funded by, or it has any ties to the Shining Path. In fact, I was watching some interviews in Spanish that were taking place in Peru, and he said a couple things. He said, no Chavismo here. He was talking down Maduro, which is interesting because when you read the Peru Libre PDF that you sent as well, that whole thing talks about Chavez and Evo Morales extremely positively. So I'm kind of like wondering the same thing. Like, I'm wondering, is this like a strategy to be like, oh, we're not that leftist, or is it like he's really like doing this because he doesn't want to be associated with that? Because it is a very difficult line to walk in Peru when you have people that lived under, you know, both Fujimori's regime, where he committed, you know, human abuse and human just atrocities, and also the you know, the what they called the terrorist Shining Path with what's his name?
Talking about the leader, Ismael Guzman, or
Ismael Guzman.
Yeah.
Also known as Presidente Gonzalo.
Yeah,
that's how they knew him. Would you guys say that the Skeptical Mantis, this is kind of for you, would you say that that Shining Path established an actual Maoist ideal, or like why do you think they turned in that direction? Because I've heard and I've read conflicting stories of why they turned in this very like, oh, you know, like, let's bomb Miraflores, which is one of the elite areas in Peru. Now, they attacked the industries that were elite, right? They attacked the banking industry. They attacked the merchant class, which was a representation of capitalism. So I get that. You know, we always say here, like, eat the rich, right? We're like, if we were to attack something as leftists, we would go after the Pentagon, we'd go after the Fed, we would go after a lot of the you know, Bezos, Amazon, all these things. We say those things. Do you think that that's how it would manifest? Do you think like what else could they have possibly done that would have made it a better situation?
That's a really good question. And summing up a failed revolution is much harder than summing up a victorious revolution, because, you know, a lot of the people that have all the information and all the knowledge ended up dead or in jail, including, for example, Presidente Gonzalo. He's been in prison, barely been able to communicate with the public. So why did they go in that negative direction? I think they were reacting to brutal attacks from the state, and they just took it too far. And they also, if the goal is people's war, as they call it, or la guerra popular, popular war, I think they kind of contradicted a basic aspect of popular war, because they did a bunch of unpopular stuff that people saw as insane, you know? And it's hard to know, how would you react if your people started getting like mass murdered, you know?
Right.
But I was telling Franco that I feel like, as you said, Fiorella, killing in war and killing in revolution, I mean, yo, it's just a fact of history. It's not like, I don't think it's something that should be overly celebrated. It should just be something that's accepted as a necessity of history, in my point of view as a communist. But it shouldn't be overly, like, you know, ritualistic and bloodthirsty. Like, that's really not a good look. And I do think that is one criticism against the Shining Path, that they had a very like religious kind of sense of like spilling blood equaling progress. And war is much more complicated than that. Sometimes, you know, battles can be won, enemies can be destroyed, and wars can still end up against whoever won the battles, you know?
Yeah, what do you think, Ramiro?
I think that, well, first of all, I just want to start off by mentioning that I do support the candidate with Free Peru, Pedro Castillo. I think that although some people on the left, especially in the first world left, have criticisms that he's not pure enough or holy enough, I think that he represents us. He represents somebody on the left in Peru that people on broad sectors of society can unite with and get along with. When I first got into leftism, when I first got into socialism, I identified more. I was very attracted to Maoism. I was very attracted to the Shining Path. I was like really into learning about Abimael Guzman and People's War. And on appearance, I think there's a lot of great things that we can take from it, learn from it, take the good and the bad. I tend to view things in a more realistic way, in a way that's not, I never say like I'm 100% this or 100% that, because I borrow from many different ideologies and kind of combine them. And I think that's what being a Marxist, you know, if we're going to talk about leftism and socialism and Marxism, what is the central guiding science of Marxism? It's dialectical materialism. It's the understanding that the world is constantly changing, constantly in motions. Like Lenin said, if you're confronted with new conditions in 24 hours, your tactics have to change in 12 hours. And so part of being a Marxist is not living in the past. Part of being a Marxist is understanding that the Soviet Union will never happen exactly as it happened. The Chinese Revolution will never happen exactly as it happened, because we live in totally new conditions and we live in totally different countries where the conditions for revolution are very different. And looking at, for example, if we look at the history of Peruvian communism, we can look back at Jose Carlos Mariátegui, who founded the Communist Party of Peru in the early 30s. He was a genius. I mean, read his 7 essays on Peruvian reality. He's talking about syncretizing, molding indigenous society with socialism, because a lot in the postmodern left, there tends to be a lot of this kind of people kind of talk smack about socialism. They say, you know, it's a white man's ideology, it's horrible, you know, if we're indigenous, we shouldn't appropriate this European ideology. And conversely, there's also the opposite trend where people who are Eurocentric Marxists who only focus on, the white worker struggle in the European countries. And I think studying Mariátegui is a great synthesis of the two, where he says, let's adapt Marxism and socialism to the indigenous conditions of Peru. Because as we know, in Peruvian society, even prior to the Inca society, there were communal structures already in place, right? And so we can adapt that to the 21st century. And so with that understanding of Marxism in mind, Marxism is not a religion, it's not a dogma. And secondly, Marxism is not intended to bring terror and violence and horror to people. Marxism is about bringing peace, stability, progress for people. And that's exactly what Pedro Castillo's talking about. He's talking about working with small businesses to help get more income, to help working class families. It's not the sexiest thing. He's not holding up an AK and saying long live People's War. He's not, doing all these. But again, we have to move past the realm of appearances that even Marx and Lenin themselves talk about. And even Mao himself, who says, we pick up the gun to put down the gun. And unfortunately, I think within the first world, and especially unfortunately with a lot of, and this includes myself, I was like this as well when I was first getting into Marxism. It's attractive. You hear about, the Shining Path, you hear about the People's War, and there are certainly things I admire and appreciate about that. But when you live in conditions of poverty and terrorism, when your daily life is violence, you don't want more violence. You want stability. You want to prosper. You want to grow. And so that's why I think that Pedro Castillo's tactics are amazing. I think that what he's doing in uniting, and also as well, as a critique of the Sendero Luminoso as well, they were mainly based in the countryside, which, yes, I think the Peruvian countryside is a big factor of society. But in the 21st century, most of the world has become urbanized. And that's an unfortunate reality. Most people, because of large-scale factory farming, because of climate change, have been forced into these tiny, cramped urban areas like Lima, like Callao, Cajama, all these places, right? And so you can't build a revolution on just the peasantry and rural areas. You have to include cities, the urban landscape, all of the uprisings that we've seen. Look at the uprisings, for example, that are taking place now in Colombia and Haiti. They're taking place in the cities, right? That's the center of revolutionary activity. And if we want to take a Leninist approach to understanding Peru, we have to go to where the people are. We have to think the way the people think. And so I think allying ourselves with a group that sure had some, good things that they talked about, promoted, but it's not even really relevant in the 21st century, I think doesn't really make sense. So that's why I do support Pedro Castillo. He's not, again, like Fiorella said, I don't agree with him on everything, but I think his approach to being like, look, we need to win over a nation. We need to win over millions of people. You're not going to win over millions of people, especially a country like Peru that has, in the media, so much of the anti-communist propaganda, against the Shining Path. It's going to be hard. That's a lot of a long process, right? And so Pedro Castillo, I think, is taking the right approach. And lastly, I just want to say as well that we shouldn't always necessarily rely on what people say. We should always look at what people do. For example, early on in the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro said, "I am not a Marxist." Fidel Castro said, "This is a revolution for Cuban liberation, Cuban nationalism." At the first demonstrations of the Cuban Revolution, they waved the Cuban flag, they sang the Cuban national anthem. It wasn't until 1961 that they declared the socialist character of the Cuban Revolution. And that process, that dialectical process, evolved into socialism. Same thing with Hugo Chavez, right? We saw in 1999, he was elected. He's like, I'm not for socialism or capitalism. I'm for the third way. I'm for Bolivarianism, this new ideology that he came up with. And slowly but surely, 2002, the coup happened. He says, we're the Socialist United Party of Venezuela. Sandinista Revolution, Nicaragua as well. They started off saying, we're Christians, we're against Somoza's dictatorship. And then the Sandinistas eventually declared socialism. So I think it's important that early on, we don't just write off Pedro Castillo because of certain things that he said. We have to pay close attention to what he's doing and not just what he's saying.
Ramiro, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
All right, so you quoted Mao earlier, right? You said, you quoted Mao as saying, we pick up the gun so that we could put down the gun. But Castillo and his party never picked up the gun. So I feel like we're kind of skipping a major step of Marxism. I read through the Peru Libre platform, party platform, and it didn't talk about revolution really. I did a search inside the document for the word revolution, and it mostly used the term as an adjective to describe other things, but they weren't talking about revolution in the Marxist sense in terms of revolutionary war, smashing the state, overthrowing the bourgeoisie, workers, dictatorship. It did not include any of that. I think there are limitations for sure of this electoral path, although I would agree that if he wins, it's a step in the right direction. You said that Marxism is about adapting to the material conditions, and I agree with that. I think most people agree with that in theory, but then it's like, what does that really mean in the real world? Because I have to question whether some things don't change. Some things do stay constant in terms of the lessons of revolutionary history. Like, I think socialism being a militaristic ideology throughout history is pretty consistent. Marx said in the Communist Manifesto that the bourgeoisie would tremble at a communist revolution. He was talking about putting fear in the elites. He was dead ass talking about terrorizing the elites. Mao talked about without a people's army, the people have nothing. I don't want to throw a bunch of cliches at you, but there's a reason some of these things do become cliche, because there's some truth in it. And ultimately, do you think that there could be maybe a limitation to this electoral path and like the whole Bolivarian path? Because, we saw how they tried to coup Hugo Chavez back in the day. Respect to him, he came back. I gotta respect that. Like, any group that can stay in power in the face of imperialist aggression, I gotta respect that. As a communist, like, isn't that what it's about? Holding state power, serving the people, governance. Basically, yeah, he fought off the imperialists. I respect that. But, it seems like they're kind of, from an outsider's point of view, it seems like they're always on edge. Like, Venezuela, they have had some very violent protests in the last few years against them. They had that failed, Bay of Piglets. The U.S. tried to send mercenaries over there. Colombia is like, right next to them, and they're a U.S. puppet, basically. Like, I don't know. To me, from an outsider's point of view, sometimes the Bolivarian movements in this electoral path seems like somewhat fragile. Like, I wonder, aren't they going to have to either move to the left and start like actually expropriating the bourgeoisie, taking their property by force, or the opposite? Like, I don't see how they can stay in that middle ground for so long. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think I actually agree with you on almost all the points you raised. I think that with the Leninist understanding of the state that, under capitalism, this is a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat needs to forcibly take over the state and use the state to smash the bourgeoisie, the ruling class. And you need to use the state apparatus in order to liberate the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I definitely have that same viewpoint as well. And I think that I agree with you. I agree that there are limits to electoralism. There are definitely limits to the Bolivarian pink tide. I have many critiques of the Bolivarian pink tide. However, one thing that I think is important to mention is that when you govern a country, when you're running a country, you don't get a magic wand, right? It's not like you become president and somebody's like, here's this magic wand. Now, with this, you can do whatever you want. You can reimagine, redesign the whole country however you want to redesign it. It doesn't work like that, right? When you're governing a country, imagine a country as big. What's the population of Peru, right? Like 30 million plus people. That's a lot of fucking people, right? Yeah. You're talking about a lot of big interests. You have to know how to manage the economy. Who's gonna run the trade industry? Who's gonna run the oil industry? Who's gonna and unfortunately, the means of production, right, are in the hands of the bourgeoisie. They're in the hands of the limeños, the criollos in Lima, who have been historically there for centuries, right? They're in their hands. Now, if we look back at history, for example, if we look at Cambodia, one of the failures of the Khmer Rouge and Maoism in Cambodia, was that they immediately thought that they could immediately jump to socialism without industrializing the country, with just immediately wiping out, killing your way into socialism. And it doesn't work like that. You know, you have to form alliances. As sour as it may be, as much as it sucks, you have to form alliances with certain sectors of the society that you don't even like, that you don't want to fuck with, in order to build socialism. Because socialism, in order to keep people happy and prosperous and in defense of the revolution, you have to build the means of production. You have to maintain stability. You're going to lose people if you're only talking about killing and we're just going to kill the rich and we're going to shoot everybody who doesn't. You need scientists, you need engineers, you need people who know how to run trade and infrastructure. And unfortunately, those things are still in the hands of the bourgeoisie. And so I think, again, going back to the Marxist understanding is like, okay, Pedro Castillo, like, even though he's not saying all these radical things, he's not talking about an armed revolution against the rich. He may very well do those things gradually, because you need to. It's not again, we're materialists, we're not idealists. This is not about dreaming up your dream society and then just, okay, it happens. You have to work with
you, Ramiro. But what about I totally agree with you.
Matt, we'll get back to this because I want to give other people like a chance to speak and bring up like all the other stuff that's going on with the Peruvian election.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So Fiorella, would you think that voting for the lesser of two evils here, with Keiko and Pedro Castillo, is not the same as voting for the lesser of two evils in the U.S.? Because I was thinking it's not the same thing, because with the U.S., like, we have two candidates that are usually represented by the two major parties that are bought off, whereas in Peru, like in this case, this is a country that is a victim of imperialism, and we have an actual outsider candidate here that could reduce harm and is running in a Marxist party. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so regarding that, I definitely think it's completely different, because you actually have like an actual leftist that is attempting to nationalize certain industries in a very subtle way. He's spoken about it. The constitution that's currently there isn't good either. The involvement of the United States, the expelling of the DEA. We're talking about major changes to Peru that would pretty much begin the movement of ousting U.S. interference. And of course, we know that the United States and the West are continuously interfering in Latin America. If Peru were to turn their backs on this imperialist, capitalist U.S. boot, they could potentially form an alliance with Bolivia. They could potentially form an alliance with Venezuela. The revolution seems closer in Latin America than it does here. And it's interesting because, you know, in the United States, we have all of this access, right? We have all these comforts, all this wealth. People still want to come here. And the United States still has this image, of course, portrayed in Hollywood, that, you know, you can make your dreams come true. There is a sector of the Peruvian population that wants that. Like, when I went to Peru a few years ago, you know, it was framed like, oh, Peru's doing really well. They have malls now. There's like nightclubs. They have like fast food, McDonald's. It's like a lot of people, especially in Lima, right, see that as a positive. Oh, Peru is becoming more first world like, industrialized. Look at these people go. But then there's the other side, the indigenous side, the Andean regions, the La Selva, right, the jungle, La Sierra, and the mountain region. And like you see how those people live, and their ideology tends to be more leftist because they have been oppressed by by capitalism, and they are more true to their indigenous roots. As we know, the Incan Empire was like highly communist in the way their government ruled. And it's like we're still fighting this battle where we have the one sector that wants to go forward and move into the modern 21st century of Peru, and then one segment that's like, no, we have to keep true to our roots. Why do we have all these people coming into our sectors of government? These military men, the United States are just coming in, and they're pretty much teaching Peruvian officials how to oppress people. Like, we don't want that anymore. This is not who we are. And so in the context of everything, it's really a fight that shouldn't be just cornered into intellectualism or elitism, right? Hugo Chavez was an indigenous working class man. You have Nicolas Maduro, very similar. You have Evo Morales, very similar. People who came from very little. In Peru, with Pedro Castillo, you seem to have the same thing. There was a documentary, or it was like a 9-minute spot they did on him, where he lives in a very, very modest house with his wife and his kids, and he has these 15 dudes in ponchos protecting him. He was chewing coca. He's a very working class guy and a teacher who is educated. This is a little bit different than other aspects I've seen, where they come from being bus drivers or something more just more working class, less intellectual. This guy is both working class and of the intellectual class. He's a teacher, his wife's a teacher. It's really interesting, and I think it's kind of, from where I'm looking at it, I think it's a good compromise for some people who want something more left, and some people who are afraid of anything remotely related to the Shining Path, and of course people who just cannot vote for Keiko Fujimori. A lot of them say that they're stuck in this whole lesser of evils thing, right? Some of the Peruvians are I don't know who's worse, but obviously in the context of the political ideology and what Peru Libre wants to do versus what Keiko Fujimori wants to do, we know that the way better option obviously is Pedro Castillo. One thing I did want to point out in relation to the Shining Path, I don't know if you guys know this, but Abimael Guzman was a college professor. And I just find it interesting that this whole movement came from the professional class in Peru that was supposedly trying to protect the indigenous Andean class, right? I just thought that was really interesting. And in my research, I wasn't aware of that. I don't know if you guys have any questions on that, but for me, it was really interesting that he came from the professional professor intellectual class, and I'm just kind of skeptical of that. Not that education is bad, but yeah, it's just very weird to me. I don't know. I haven't found anything much more on that, but I'm going to continue doing the research.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think this is a common thing in many revolutions, where the earliest people to get involved are not the general working class masses. It's usually intellectuals. And then movements have to find a way for those intellectuals to integrate into mass movements. Otherwise, they'll remain irrelevant. So from my understanding, Gonzalo initially started off in the universities, right? Because he was a professor, and he recruited a bunch of highly educated people, including other professors. Then they started recruiting a bunch of university students. Then their next wave of recruits was high school students. So it's they went deeper and deeper. And this was in the earliest years of the war, where they still had a good reputation and people had a lot of hope in them. People were they thought they would do good. And in the way they saw them do some good, they saw them expel local bullies. They saw them do some good things. People were yeah, we're with this. So I wouldn't overestimate, I wouldn't say the whole Shining Path was a bunch of high class professors or anything like that. It's their group developed in waves. But yeah, the earliest people were university professors, then students, then high school students. And I was reading about how initially there was a strange dynamic where the elder generations kind of, for the first few years of the war, started respecting the youth more, because I guess the elders were yo, these are the modern people, we're backwards, because they were uneducated. So it's their own children became kind of usurped the leadership of the community up to a time. But then that also created a lot of contradictions with like indigenous communities later on, because they had like a system of elders, and it was like a clash in ideologies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so Ramiro, me and Skeptical have been encountering some people who think that the only way that we can achieve like communism is there can only be a revolution, like a civil war. That's the only way we can achieve it. And we try to tell them, you don't think that at least this election will be a step in the right direction? What would be your response to that for people who say that this election is worthless because Castillo isn't enough?
My response to people who say that is to actually read the leaders that they purportedly claim to uphold. If you read Lenin, if you read Mao, if you read Marx, they all talk about the need for communists and revolutionaries to participate in elections, not to view it as the end all be all, not to view it in a teleological point of view where it's the end. It's the end goal is getting that platform, getting the election and winning. It's a tactic, and Lenin talks about this in two tactics of social democracy, where the Bolsheviks, the communists, should participate in elections not with the anticipation that that's going to lead to class struggle and class liberation, but understanding scientifically that the masses follow elections. If you talk to most working class people who don't give a fuck about politics, who don't care, they may not even know who Mao is, who Marx is, and that's just the reality. Even most working class people, unfortunately, who are not up to date with different theories of politics, they get political around election time, and that's just the reality. And so with that in mind, we have to, instead of being redder than thou, instead of being like, oh well, they're not revolutionary enough or radical enough, we have to tactically understand, look, this is where the people are at. The people follow elections, they watch that. We should be in that space. I say the same thing to communists about religious groups. If you go to the hoods of most part, like I'm from New York, right? In New York, you go to the hoods of New York and you see religious people. You see Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witness, early 6, 7 in the morning, talking to people, passing out pamphlets. Am I a Christian? No. Am I a believer in that? Not at all. But we should be studying their tactics because they're obviously winning that war within our people. And so it's the same thing. That's the same response I have to communists who think that any sort of participation in elections is selling out. That's where the masses are. And part of being a communist, a scientific socialist, is knowing where the masses are and how to identify them and work alongside them to push them in a more revolutionary direction. Look, it could totally happen that, let's say, Castillo comes into power, he starts bringing in incremental reforms, and people start liking those reforms. And if there's a threat of a coup against him, like the way we saw happen against Chavez, against Evo Morales, against other people, that could strengthen the socialist movements. It goes in so many different ways. And we have to get out of this mindset that it's an instruction manual. Communism is it's not step A, step B, every country has its own process. And it could be that, he gets elected, people like the reforms, and once they start rolling them back, people, the grassroots re-radicalizes it. So anything can happen. And I think, just to kind of wrap up on this point, I think people have to also, for people who say that, especially a lot of people in the first world who don't necessarily travel to the global south, spend a week or two in the global south. Spend a week in some of the hardest, the rural parts of Peru, the barrios of Lima. Spend a week or a month with some of the poorest people. People want progress and stability and hope. And I think that, by just kind of critiquing and destroying things, you're not giving people an option. You have to always be positive oriented. You always have to be in what you're for and what you're fighting for, not just what you're against. And I think that's why Pedro Castillo has had more of a success in this recent round of the Peruvian elections, because he's saying, look, I'm not even going to touch that stuff with the shining path or whatever. That's in the past. That's in the 20th century. I'm talking about today. And what is going on in Peru today? Poverty, COVID-19, horrible corruption. There's 3 presidents in 2 years. There's clearly instability in Peru. And people don't want more instability. They want more stability. They want more peace. And that's what socialism will bring them. And even the logo of Free Peru, I think, is cool. It's like the pencil education, which is also a big factor because there's a lot of racist education policies against the indigenous majority of Peru, who are not able to access the same educational instruments as the majority of the population. And so I think that ultimately the left in the US and around the world, they have to realize that it's not, some idealist revolutionary fantasy. It's not always going to be the sexy gun-toting gorillas in the mountains. This is about moms, giving food for moms. This is about educating women, eradicating homelessness, building jobs, building peace and stability. And that's what socialism is about. And we have to move past the operative, performative elements of whatever existed in the 20th century.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing also is this election is an opportunity, and also with Castillo's presidency, it's an opportunity for some people to be radicalized and be like, oh, because a big propaganda piece that the mainstream media is pushing out in Peru is that, oh, if Castillo wins, Peru's going to end up like Venezuela. And they don't know that the reason why Venezuela is suffering right now, it's not because of socialism. It's not primarily because of Maduro's policies that he's implementing. It's because of the U.S. sanctions. And there's evidence that's presented by studies by the Center for Economic and Policy Research that shows that it's because of the U.S. sanctions that tens of thousands of people in Venezuela are dying, and that's why they're fleeing, and that's why a lot of them are going to other countries in Latin America, and Peru is one of those countries. Fierro, you were talking about in your video that you did on the Combo Couch about how there's xenophobia in Peru, how they view Venezuelans as like, oh, they're coming here, they're taking our jobs. There's also I've heard stereotypes because I have family members on Facebook. I see some of the things that they share. Unfortunately, some of them do buy into stereotypes of them believing that, oh, they're all thieves, they're all bad, they're not educated, they're coming here and stealing our jobs, and it's because of the socialism over there. So they're willing to put up with Keiko, who they were against in the 2016 election in Peru, when it was Keiko Fujimori versus Pedro Pablo Kuczynski PPK. They were very against Fujimori, and they were for PPK, who was a bit more liberal than Castillo. But now they're so afraid of communism or looking like Venezuela that they're willing to put up with Keiko, who's, again, her father has a history of being a far-right dictator. They're traumatized. They're traumatized about what happened in the 80s to the 90s. And I don't know if that's also a similar experience that you're having, Fierlo. Like, my family, they're like, oh, you don't know what's going on. Like, we know what's going on because we're here in Peru. Even though they're only in Lima, which is a bubble. Lima doesn't represent the entirety of Peru. Like, the majority of Peru is not Lima. Like, Lima is a bubble.
Yeah.
So
my family lives there too. Lima, that's where they're from. It's the capital. It's the industrialized part of Peru. They don't have the same. And Peru Libre talks about it. There's completely different necessities, via social and economic necessities in Lima versus there are in La Sierra or in Las Amazonas, and there's different regions that have different needs. And they're absolutely, you're right, they're traumatized. They're willing, kind of like here in the United States, where people were willing to vote for Biden, somebody that is a complete, neocon, is policy wise, right? He'll just say a couple of woke things and they'll be like, oh, well, it's against Trump and Trump's so bad. And it's like, wait a minute, this guy wrote the crime bill. He wrote the Patriot Act. Forget it. That was in the past. They're willing to do that because the fear that has been pushed in Peru of communism, of you're going to be Venezuela. We're going to turn into Chavismo and Nicolas Maduro, and they're bringing in those people. Look at those Venezuelans. They're coming here and they're taking our jobs. Mm-hmm. They're saying the same things that some of the Trumpers say about immigrants. It's it's crazy, but this is what happens. This is just the way things go when the oligarchs pit you against each other, because that's exactly what it is. We have completely privatized industries in Peru that are run by the West, right? And a country that isn't running itself, yet that's why so many people in Lima can't see. They're living there, but they don't see who's really pulling the strings. And unfortunately, it's kind of like I see that because I see both ends, right? I see like I understand why people who see Venezuelans coming in and who don't know the imperialist context of everything and the sanctions would think, oh, like look, their country's ruined and they're coming here. We don't want that. I can see people being scared of losing their jobs because you have Venezuelans coming in getting paid less money to do the work that other people got paid more money to do. It's the same issues that we have here where it develops the sort of, well, I'm not going to look up. I'm going to look at the Venezuelans coming in here and I'm going to, make things up about them, generalize that everybody's a thief, that everybody's uneducated. You have similar things happening in Europe as well because of the neoliberalism, especially in France. You have like the whole xenophobia happening too. And it's just a byproduct of this system. Like you're always going to have that. You're always going to have working class people pitted against each other based on what country they're from. And instead of blaming the real culprits, they're going to blame each other. And that's something that I think I agree. Pedro Castillo and the Peru Libre could help usher in actual success for working people in Peru in a way that doesn't reinforce the belief that all communism is violence, that all socialism is just a bunch of crazy radicals with guns. Like I think Peru's in a different place in the United States because Peru is still a third world country. It's a developing nation. And I think there's more of a pathway because there are other socialist countries right now in South America. There's still a path electorally to make conditions better. I think in America, I have a hard time seeing an electoral path. The reason being that we are the oppressors. We are the ones that are ruining everything for everybody else. So in order to take down the imperialist boot of the United States and the West that is going around and jailing journalists like Julian Assange, that is going around sanctioning everybody, bombing Syrians, doing absolutely nothing with the Palestinian genocide that's happening or the Yemeni genocide, and is still going to continue keeping troops in Afghanistan, privatizing these troops, etc. Blinken is saying he's going to involve himself in Bolivia again. I mean, all of this, right? We are the issue. So for me, there is no electoral path in the United States. There has to be an uprising in the United States. And I think that is what will help usher in more peaceful revolutions in other countries rather than having the continuous, let's have a Marxist uprising that entails a dictatorship of the proletariat and, crushing the elite in Peru. It's just gonna reinforce the CIA's push of, oh, communists are bad, look what they're doing, etc. Like, I think there's a difference in that context.
Also, Fiorella, could I push back real quick a little bit?
Well, one second, Skeptical, because I have a question for you too that would add on to that. I was just going to say that also the Peru's elections and Latin America's elections are more secure, right? Yeah. And they're not privately owned like how the U.S.'s are. But yeah, Skeptical Mantis, we were talking about like some of the downfalls of Sendero Luminoso, how they were relying too much on cult of personalities. Well, obviously we talked about how some of them took it a step too far, but yeah, what do you think we can learn from some of those mistakes? And also you can explain what you were just going to say to Fiorella.
Oh yeah, I was going to push back a little bit on what Fiorella and Ramiro were saying. Can you imagine how things might look if Castillo wins and then he just continues neoliberalism? Like, what if he is just too weak to do anything? Or what if he tries and it doesn't work? Or what if he doesn't even try? We don't know what he's about. He's like a wild card in my eyes. So don't you think that could actually lead the country to go further right? Because that's what usually happens after failed leftist movements. That energy has to go somewhere else. So it either goes farther left or it goes to another extreme in the right.
I think I could potentially go that way. Like, he could be seen, as a failure if he still keeps neoliberalism. But then he could also seem like somebody that's caught in between Western imperialism and trying to appease half of a population that's too scared to go left, and the other half that that wants something more leftist, right? Then I don't think that would be as bad as him coming in and trying to establish like a violent overthrow, right, of the bourgeoisie, and doing the same thing that the Shining Path did. And that's what it would be in the eyes of these people. I think that would swing the country further right, because they're already like scared. There's a like that just like the way these people think, like my own father was like, oh, but he's a super leftist and he's affiliated. I'm like, no, he's not. Like, stop buying into this media bullshit that they're doing against him. I think in the context of Peru and how just people are just literally just traumatized by everything that happened with the Shining Path, and also the way Venezuela and Bolivia have been portrayed in the media as just these countries that are super socialist and they failed the people, that like they get just the same way that America has like 3 companies that own all the media. In Peru, it's the same thing. Like 3 companies own all the media. So the vast majority of the media there is extremely destructive. It's propaganda, and unfortunately it's had an effect on how these people view leftist movements. And I think if he were to be any more radical or revolutionary in his thought, in his outward behavior, I think it would turn some people off. This is like rare for me to say, but like I think like him actually establishing himself distantly, verbally, is actually not a bad idea, just based on how just fragile Peru is in relation to leftist movements. We don't know really who he is, but we have seen him in action leading teacher strikes. We have seen his work as a teacher and as an activist, and I am more comfortable with that than like looking at, he said a couple things about Maduro and stuff, and that did bother me. I'm not gonna lie, like that was like, oh, like, is this guy for real? Like, because Peru has had a lot of people like who was it? Like, was it the Alan Garcia? There were people that were supposed to be more leftist, right? And they turned around and they weren't that. And it ruined a lot of things. But I think it would be worse if he was actually like more of a Maoist type, and some people would be like equating that to the Shining Path, and I think that would swing the country more right, in my opinion.
Then the media in Peru would more accurately be portraying him as an extremist.
Right.
But yeah, Ramiro, what do you think?
Yeah, I gotta agree with Fiorella, and I do understand where you're coming from, Skeptical Mantis. I understand where you're coming from. Look, like, I've seen it happen, and I think a great example of that is El Salvador. You have the FMLN in 2009. Mauricio Funes was elected representing the FMLN, which was a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla movement, and his government totally flopped. It moved to the right. It became neoliberal. It was not able to implement a lot of the socialist progressive gains that the FMLN was based on, and the base of the FMLN was totally devastated, and they felt betrayed. And now you have a right-wing president, Bukele, who is a neoliberal, pro-US. And so I definitely understand where you're coming from in the sentiment. That being said, I think we also have to, again, work with what exists in the real world, in the material world today. There is no magical third option. There is no magical, mystical Maoist group in the mountains that exists today that is able to captivate the masses, right? There is no movement that's more purely radical that will save the day. We have to work with what exists in the society. And
I don't think it should be portrayed as magical, though, because there are many different insurgent groups around Latin America that are, for better or worse, resisting state power, even just because the state is weak. Some of them are like drug cartels. Like, I mean, there could be all different kind of armed groups all around Latin America. There's paramilitaries. There's like if you look at Mexico just as one example, like, I don't know, I think the reality is that especially in Latin America, like, armed politics are very relevant and there's such a long history of it. It shouldn't be romanticized. I don't think it's sexy at all. I think it's actually terrible. It's unfortunate that I feel like war is honestly the only option if we're going to have a real revolution, save ourselves from climate change, disaster, save ourselves from World War III. Basically, I feel like capitalism is going to destroy the world if we don't have people's war.
Right. I get what you're saying, but what I'm talking about for the majority of people in countries. If you talk to the majority of people in Peru right now, do you think the majority of Peruvians will say yes, I want people's war?
Of course not. Of course
not
not.
at all.
But the thing is, revolutions always start as being relatively fringe, right? You can't show me any revolution that was popular the day it was formed.
Indeed, for sure. I definitely agree with you. However, they start off as fringe. Their ideas are a minority, but the tactics, again, going back not to the ideas, but the tactics in real life, appeal to the broad masses of people. There's a great quote that Fidel Castro mentioned early in the Cuban Revolution, was that if I would have told everybody, all of my comrades, that I was a Marxist-Leninist from day one, we probably wouldn't have been successful in the Cuban Revolution, because you have to work your way up and build yourself up to that point. If if Castillo comes into power and he starts nationalizing some industries, he starts giving land reform, right, which would be huge for Peru. People would love that, right? Free education, free healthcare, without even necessarily having to call it socialism. He could call it bubblegumism. He could call it whatever he wants to call it. It doesn't even have to be on paper socialism, but if he's materially in the real world tactically doing those things and people start enjoying that, then he can start saying, look, this is what socialism is. And that's actually what has happened historically. Look at the Cuban Revolution, again, going back to the 1961 Declaration, when Fidel Castro said, this is officially a socialist revolution. And he started off that speech, by the way, saying, do you guys like the land reform? And everybody was like, yeah. Do you guys like the free education? Yeah. Do you guys like, having national sovereignty and rights for Cubans? Yeah. This is socialism. That's how you win people. You're not going to win people by appealing to an outdated 20th century ideology or group that only promotes violence and blood and chaos and terror and has such a bad image already. That's in the past. People are not, you're not going to change most Peruvians' minds about the Shining Path. So looking forward, how do we bring and adapt socialism to the 21st century, where we can say socialism is progress, socialism is wealth, socialism is stability, socialism is peace, and that's not to say, right, that's not to totally, derail the Shining Path or the guerrilla movements of the 20th century. There's things that you can take and adapt and learn from them. But I think Castillo's approach is correct in being like, look, we're gonna scare the fuck out of people if we start talking about people's war, if we start talking about armed struggle. We need to appeal to the moms, to the people in the hoods who are tired of violence, tired of poverty, tired of chaos.
But you just gave the example of Fidel Castro, and he came to power through a bloody war. Two times he tried, right? He shot up the Moncada barracks, got arrested, all that. He thought he was gonna, get put to death, all that. He actually picked up the gun twice. He had a chance to survive. He came back, shot up Cuba. So I guess the example doesn't really work in my eyes.
Yeah, but that was the 1950s.
Okay. Yeah, things are different now, and also the U.S. is also more technologically advanced. They have more control now. The corporations are more powerful. I think that they would intervene, and they would have they would be able to manufacture consent for us to step into Peru if they took that route of a revolution. Go ahead.
Cuba's still sovereign, right?
Huh?
At the end of the day, Cuba is still sovereign, and they.
But again, that was a different time, though.
No, today is Cuba not still sovereign?
Yeah, but that's after they were able to liberate themselves.
All right. The point is that the U.S. could theoretically just invade Cuba any day, right? Because the U.S. is so strong, but somehow Cuba manages to stay free for decades. That's all I'm trying to say.
What do you guys think?
I mean, no, I totally get that aspect. I mean, I just think it would be more difficult in Latin America because of geography, honestly, for Peru to usher in just a giant overthrow. Also, the United States, there's something that Marxism, Leninism, every ism did not take into consideration, and this is something I often talk about, is the the big tech, like the power of big tech, the power of the internet, the power of social media that has completely just both accelerated knowledge and accelerated propaganda. Because the reason we, back in Marxist history, you're fighting revolutions, you're communicating via person to person contact, letters, pamphlets, manifests. Now, if you're trying to start a revolution, everything you do is literally going to be somehow spied on via phone lines, wiretapping, your social media profiles, etc. And the power that big tech has over, and the jurisdiction they have right now over any sort of insurgency is insane. I mean, right now, they're painting anybody that's actually telling the truth as a conspiracy theorist. And a lot of it is working. A lot of the propaganda is working. A lot of it isn't, because now we have more knowledge, right? We have people like YouTube shows like yours. We have YouTube, like more people kind of waking up to this whole idea. But there is still a large segment of the population in countries in Latin America that just even though they're in Latin America, they don't understand how powerful the US is, because they've been fed this idea that the United States is where you can make your dreams come true. They're proud. I've never met prouder people, to be more patriotic people than an immigrant that has come here and has succeeded in creating the sort of American dream. Like, my family, I could say my parents succeeded in their American dream. However, myself and my brother, the shit we've had to put up with in America, as far as like the economics of it, living through 2 recessions, right? Like as millennials, has been absolutely just crazy. Like, it's not fair. It's capitalism worked for the older generations. It's not working for us, which is why a lot of the younger generations are just naturally anti-capitalist, because you're living in a system where capitalism is just failing you miserably, and you're seeing things happen. This is why my younger sister started getting radicalized at a younger age than I did, because it's how do you not get radicalized? And this is one thing where I think the left is weak on, when it comes to big tech, when it comes to understanding like how powerful these institutions are and how easily they could just crack down any sort of revolution, frame it as being extremely violent, and push regimes that would just continue this sort of new Orwellian state that we're living in, where we want mandatory vaccines, where you want just like this dictatorship in a way of everything you do, your freedom, like free speech rights, etc. And when in the context of looking at what the United States is capable of doing and what the West is capable of doing, I just don't see how like having a violent overthrow in Peru, when Venezuela hasn't even done that, when Bolivia hasn't really done it in that way, would actually work in the greater context. I think it could work in a few years in Latin America. I think if there's a union between these countries like Bolivia and Venezuela and Peru, and if we could get Ecuador eventually in there, you could get, Brazil, get rid of Bolsonaro, all these, I think that those countries are powerful enough to establish a connection with Cuba as well. And then, talk to Russia and Iran. I think there's like a front there to happen. And I do think eventually the only way to have a real revolution is going to be war. Especially, like I said, in the United States, I don't see a pathway that isn't overthrowing the system. But if you talk to people, even in America, and if you talk to the average person in America, they're not there with us, dude. They just want to go back to normal. They just want to live their lives. They really don't want to see anything violent. It's always that question, right? Like, do we as leftists support violence against the state? Yeah, I mean, the state is committing violence against us, but how we employ that tactfully and the timing of it is extremely important. It could either completely destroy our movement, or it could actually happen. So it's a hard debate to have, to be honest.
Is it okay if I quickly bring up the example of Salvador Allende in Chile? He was elected in 1970. He was a Marxist, or he called himself a Marxist, but he was overthrown when he tried to actually move the country to the left. And by the time he recognized the need for military power, it was kind of a little too late. Do you think something like that could end up happening? Because we saw like hints of that with, the attempted coup against Chavez, although he was able to come back. We saw what happened to Evo Morales a few years ago, right? That was really scary, to be honest, when I was seeing those news reports, how they were attacking his house. I'm
Yeah.
like, yo, where's the people's army to protect this guy?
Right. No,
And
I think just real quick, I think that's different. I think you should, I think the military, right? The military having standing by the people is essential to a revolution, right? We're seeing like I covered this like last week, I think. There are generals that wrote a letter in the United States saying that they are sick of the CIA's involvement and they want to know like what the CIA is doing. Like they want more communication because now they're asking questions like people are wondering why we're still here, why are we still doing this? So, and we saw that, of course, in Venezuela. Maduro had the troops, right? He had the troops on his side. I think it's important that there is that attempt because you need to have some sort of army, right? Some sort of protection, some sort of threat. When you talk about Black Lives Matter and the movement as a whole, that you see a hesitancy in a lot of these groups to have armed militias by them, where people will offer, like the Black Panthers will show up, the Blue Boys will show up, they'll come with like militias and say, hey, we'll protect you because the police don't shoot at you as much, right? And they're like, no, we don't want that because the guns. Like there's always a hesitancy there, but I think it's essential because that's one of the criticisms I had of Evo Morales was that they didn't prepare a successor. They didn't prepare the military's backing there. And that's why they were able to push the coup, of course, with the help of the United States. But like, that's why they were able to do that. You do need to have the military on your side. I don't think that means that it has to be this whole like violent overthrow though. I think there's like a difference between having the military be by and for the people and supportive of the autonomy of a liberated state versus like the military forcefully committing violent acts to overthrow a regime.
Yeah, Ramiro, you can jump in too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, we can look at, there's so many comparisons throughout Latin American history, even going back to 1956, Jacobo Arbenz, progressive, not a socialist, but he was instituting land reform, actually where Che Guevara was first radicalized after leaving Peru and heading towards Central America when he stayed in Guatemala. And he saw the land redistribution program that was going on under Arbenz. Eventually the coup happened, right? And Arbenz was removed from power. He did not have a state apparatus to back him up or an armed group to back him up. And for 40 years, Guatemala was in a bloody civil war, a people's war against right-wing evangelical fascists. And Salvador Allende, I think, is another good example, right? We saw the Unidad Popular government come into power in 1970. The coup happened in 1973. Pinochet came in, instituted fascism. And so I think the lesson here is that any socialist movement, any elected leader can go in so many different ways. All sorts of things can happen. And so it's not really productive to try to replicate a model because every model is going to look different. The Peruvian Revolution is going to look totally different from the Cuban Revolution. It's going to look totally different from Chile. It's going to look totally different from Bolivia based on Peru's national conditions. And I think as revolutionaries, as people who oppose capitalism and oppose imperialism, I think the best thing we can do, especially not living in Peru, is support what the majority of working class Peruvians want and push for, even if it's not necessarily what we 100% agree with. I'll give you an example. Castillo has some more socially conservative views. There are a lot of working class people in Peru who are against gay marriage, who are against LGBTQ rights, who believe in more traditional role models for in the home and the nuclear family. Obviously, I don't necessarily follow that, but I'm not going to go and be like, oh, y'all are not, revolutionary enough or progressive enough just because you don't think exactly the way I do. And so for me, as somebody living in the first world, as somebody who lives in the imperial core, the best I can do is show my solidarity with what the majority of working class people want, even if it's imperfect, even if it doesn't meet my revolutionary checklist of what a revolutionary movement should look like. Although I do believe that any revolutionary movement that and government that comes into power, you have to consolidate the military, you have to consolidate and democratize the armed movement in terms of kind of like what Venezuela has been doing in terms of doing joint civic military exercises, teaching people how to defend their country. Cuba did the same as well prior to the Bay of Pigs invasion and continues to do the same. I think that is a good thing once you're in power, once you're a socialist government. But that's something that comes after building trust, right? A big part of this is building trust. It's so important, right? It's kind of like a relationship. If you've had a partner before and if you cheated on them in the past, you have to rebuild that trust. You have to work hard to rebuild that trust. And the left in Peru has a lot of work to rebuild the trust of the working class masses. Because I'm going to be real with you, a lot of Peruvian, I mean, again, this is not to say that this represents everybody, but a lot of Peruvians that I met, especially a lot of working class leftist Peruvians, do not like the Shining Path, and that's just a reality. That's just something that we have to contend with, right? And so, how do we, as leftists, regain the trust of the average working class Peruvian by following what they want to do, by working alongside them, being like, look, this is what we believe in. This work toward that at the pace that you want to. Because if we kind of go in and just go in and like, no, you need to do this, you need to do that, it pushes people away, So how do we, like Castillo's doing, how do we meet people where they're at and push them in a left socialist direction in a way that can become more revolutionary, in a way that can become more like Venezuela, that could become more like Cuba? And that's not to say, again, that we have to necessarily follow those models, because Peruvian socialism is going to look very different from those countries because it's going to be based on the local conditions. But I think ultimately, I do support Castillo. I don't think he's perfect by any means. I think nobody is perfect. But I think right now in this real world, in what actually exists in terms of the left, I think that he's the best shot that the left has had in Peru in a while.
Yeah, I think that if he wins, he could also I think Chavez, would you guys say that he learned from what happened to Allende and that's why he took control of the military? I think that's something that Castillo should also learn from too. Evo Morales unfortunately didn't gain control the same way that Hugo Chavez did and Maduro, but that right there would be protection from like any interference that the US could try to do, right? Skeptical?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, ultimately, it is going to be a question of military power. That is what it's going to come down to. The question is when and how. That's how I see it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think restructuring the government, the society is definitely number one on any socialist government's agenda. And I think that it's very important. Restructuring not only the institutions, but the values that people have, the way people think, the way people view society. And unfortunately, if you don't do that, we've seen the example again of Chile and other countries, and I think it's so important. But I have confidence in the Peruvian people. I think that although within the last 40 or so years, the left has had trouble winning over a lot of the Peruvian masses, I think the fact that Castillo came in has such a strong lead, the fact that he's going up against Fujimori, somebody who represents some of the most disgusting elements of capitalism, of imperialism, I think that this could be a really strong moment for the left in Peru, and I'm cheering them on. I hope that they win. I'm not going to sit on the sidelines and say that he's not good enough for me and be redder than thou. I'm going to support whatever way I can the Peruvian people, the Peruvian diaspora, to win back their country. Because as going back to how we started off in the beginning, what is the slogan of Peru Libre? no more poor in a rich country. And that's really what it's about. It's about bringing the resources and wealth of Peru, one of the most wealthiest countries in terms of history, one of the cradles of human civilization, resources, minerals, culture, food. Like, Peru has so much value that can feed and clothe everybody the 10 times over, right? And it's possible, it's there. It's just a matter of having a socialist system in place that will bring that. And I hope that Castillo's message of socialism and construction and progress, not looking back, but looking forward, I hope that's the winning message. And that's really all I can say.
Yeah. Yeah, just echoing, you know, all of that. I mean, I think things need to be dismantled. I mean, I think when you're talking about the predator class, you do have to eventually, you're going to have to dismantle the system. You know, you want to get rid of capitalism. You want to get rid of just a totalitarian imperial military. I just think, like, flat, if you're going to say you're going to do that flat out, they're going to do everything they can to destroy you right away. You're never going to get the chance. I think it's important to be very strategic about it, about how you present it to people. I've seen that in action here, even in the United States, where there are like co-ops in Iowa, and they don't call them co-ops. They call them something else, right? And it's like these Republicans are like, oh, we love this store, blah, 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 blah. They don't realize that it's a freaking like socialist thing. It's a co-op. If you talk to people on the ground, whether it's in Peru or the United States, and you present to them ideas without an ism, and you say, hey, do you guys want, you know, more money for education? Yeah. Do you guys want more money for healthcare? Yeah. Okay. Like, I think it's really how you present the ideas that are like based on economics. Like, what is going to be better for the average working class Peruvian? Are they actually going to be helped in this way? Like, I think that's a really good way of doing it, because of the fragility of the anti-leftism that has plagued the country for the last 40 years. And if you're facing an opponent that literally must lose, I mean, if she wins, if Keiko Fujimori wins, I fear for Peru. I fear for Latin America, because she will 100%. She had Rudy Giuliani as one of the people on her team at one point. I mean, she was speaking to the far right in this country, that we know where their interests lie. So she can't win. Like, if she wins, that'll be extremely destructive. And I think the left, any left, whether we're here in the United States or in Latin America, should back Pedro Castillo, because I think he presents I don't want to say pragmatic, because that's what neoliberals say, but like a solution that is really realist in the context of the historical context of Peru, where Peruvians are at, where they're slowly, you know, we're facing propaganda, very anti-Venezuelan, anti-Chavista, anti-Maduro, anti-Evo Morales, anti-Bolivia. All of these things are happening. In order to fight that, we're going to have to understand it from their point of view as to why they feel this way. So that's why I think it's important to understand the history behind, you know, Alberto Fujimori, the CIA, and then of course Shining Path, and why people feel the way they do. Because even having this discussion, for a lot of my family members, even what we're saying is going to be seen as completely disrespectful and radical. And like, of course, I could care less like what that is, and in retrospect of what the reality is, you know, what the truth is. But at the same time, it's like, these are our family members. Imagine how other people are going to feel if we try to impose our idea of what it should be. So yeah, I 100% think Castillo needs to win in order for Peru to have a chance at anything more leftist, and also how that will affect Bolivia and affect Ecuador and affect Brazil. These are neighboring countries, very, very close. And I think there could be something there if Castillo wins.
I've definitely gotten that experience with my family members, like without attaching any labels or isms to anything. And I do tell them, like, do you think that there should be like more, that things should be nationalized so that it could be more, you know, distributed more evenly to the public, or that the healthcare system should be improved and not privatized? Like, they agree with that stuff. But if you start talking, oh, we need socialism in Peru, they're gonna be repelled by that. So I have gotten that experience. I think, all of us here can agree Castillo is a step in the right direction. He's the most leftist candidate that I've seen Peru have in my entire life, actually, because all the other ones have been like more so liberal. Like I don't know how to equate it here in the U.S. Like Democrat kind of liberal, right? Would you say that too, Fiorella? That's Pedro Castillo is like the first candidate that's made it this far. That's in a party that calls itself Marxist. So yeah, to me, it's a step in the right direction. It's a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Yeah, go ahead.
Just real quick, one more thing I wanted to point out. He needs to make some sort of an alliance or an attempt to gain some votes from Veronica Mendoza, who was the other leftist candidate. But she was more, I feel like more like I would say like a DSA type of, I don't know, like she gave me those vibes of like, she's definitely better in terms of
socially
LGBTQ and all of the social justice issues. Not as leftist as far as like, worker strike and nationalizing things. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. But I think because of the anti-Fujimorismo movement that's also going on, it would be great if they could make some sort of alliance for him to get the votes, because in the second round is where we can see shenanigans. I mean, that happened in Ecuador, right? Like that is the way the media portrayed it, destroyed the actual leftist candidate, the indigenous faux progressive candidate that was backed by the United States, of course, also took votes away. So I don't want that to happen to Peru, and I think they need to plan for that. Just one last thing that I wanted to say.
Yeah,
we call him, sorry to interrupt, we call him Yankee Perez.
Yankee Perez?
Yeah, Yankee Perez. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, you were going to say something?
Yeah. I agree that it would be a step in the right direction if Castillo wins and he's able to do even some of what the Peru Libre platform says they're going to do. I think it would be a step in the right direction for sure. But I want to address what Ramiro was saying about keeping our ideas within reality. I do just want to point out that there are several splinter groups of the Shining Path that still exist to this day. And there have been interviews with them where they show how they're basically running their own villages in different areas. Many of them have beef with each other. They have different ideas of how to continue the war, but they are still successfully living as fugitives in somewhat liberated areas in different places. There's a group whose magazine is called Red Sun. If you want to look it up, look up Shining Path Red Sun, you'll find their website. Also, this other group called Movedef. And these people basically want to continue the revolution in different ways. So the Shining Path does still exist in some sense in reality. We should just keep that in mind. And I just want to say free Gonzalo and free all the Shining Path political prisoners. The war, a lot of bad things happened in the war, but they deserve to be free. I think they were fighting for the right thing. They've already served a lot of time in prison. They shouldn't be further demonized. Many of them are elderly. Gonzalo is very old. He should be free.
All right. So where can people find you guys?
Okay, so people can find me at the Convo Couch on Rockfin, on YouTube as well. We're still demonetized. And you can find me on Twitter at Fiorella_IM.
Yeah, you can find me on PragerU. No, I'm just playing. Now you can find me on YouTube, Ramiro Sebastian Funes. I actually just got back from Nicaragua like a few weeks ago. I'm going to be releasing a documentary about Nicaragua's, the Sandinista revolution, and how they continue to be resisting against U.S. imperialism. Unfortunately, within the left, we hear a lot about Venezuela and Cuba, and Nicaragua unfortunately gets left out a lot, but they have some really dope revolution that's still going on, still strong, the Sandinistas. So take a look out for that May 15th on YouTube. So, and I really appreciate you, Franco, for having me on, man. And I like talking to Fiorella and Skeptical Mantis. It's really cool talking to y'all. And I like the conversation because a lot of times on the left, people get so crazy. Like I've been into some spaces where people are like, "Oh my God, like you revisionist or you horrible ultra," and it's good that we can have sensible conversations like this, even if we don't see eye to eye on everything. But this is what it's all about, and I hope we can have more conversations like this in the future.
Yeah, and Skeptical.
Yeah, this was a really good talk. I had fun researching and talking with all you guys. I was really curious what y'all were gonna say. I'm kind of happy that we didn't talk that much beforehand. Me and Franco did, but I was really curious. What are Fee and Ramiro gonna say? But yeah, you could find me at Skeptical Mantis Channel 10. That's the name of my YouTube channel. I'm involved in a Black Panther study group. Franco's involved with me as well. We're studying the history of the Black Panther Party in depth because, like Ramiro was saying before, we got to understand the history of revolution in our own countries. And this is a big problem with the left. Some of them become experts on other countries, but they don't actually have many plans to make revolution in their own countries. And to me, that whole outlook is just backwards. We need to focus on political practice and how we're going to make revolution in our own countries, not about talking about China all the time. I mean, these are important topics, but, I think you see where I'm going with it. Some people only look at the international stuff, but we need to actually take initiative. We live in the U.S. empire. We're the belly of the beast. We could have a lot of effect if we actually fight.
Yeah, those study groups are important too because you learn, mistakes that people made in the past, how we can improve upon some of the mistakes that they did. Ali Alexandra's also in the Black Panther study group. She's also an MCSC network member. I had a great conversation with you guys. I really enjoyed it. I studied this, I learned more about Peru in this amount of time than I ever have in my life. Most of my perspective came from my family for most of my life. So this is really eye-opening, and I'm glad I got to spend this time with you guys. Thank you guys again for coming on, and to everybody else, don't forget to stay informed. I'll follow up with this after June 6th.